Hello, I'm doing a book review, and yes, I know it's been almost a month since my last review. Sorry about that. Now, in my last review, I mentioned how I was currently rereading Stephen King's The Stand, and I had intended that to be the next review to go up, but that is a long-as-hell book, so I decided to take a break from The Stand and read a significantly shorter novel, that being Lord of the Flies by William Goldin, which is also a book I've read before. I've actually read this twice before. Now, I've already reviewed Lord of the Flies all the way back in 2013. That review is still up, however, it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but you can still see it with a link, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out my 2013 review of this novel. Now, Lord of the Flies was published in 1954, and this was William Goldin's first novel. Now, at the time, the publishers actually did not have a lot of faith in the novel, but ironically, it would go on to become a landmark in Western literature, and it's now considered to be one of the most important novels of the 20th century. It's also a book that many of us had to read in high school. That's how I first read the book, and I remember it making a pretty big impact on me when I first read it, even though I think I was the only one in my class who actually liked the novel. Now, Lord of the Flies was inspired by an 1857 novel called The Coral Island by R.M. Ballantyne. I'm not really sure if I'm saying his last name right, but from what I understand about this novel, because I've never read it, it's basically sort of a lighthearted adventure story about three boys who end up stranded on a deserted island, but Goldin always felt that this book was too unrealistic. And he basically wanted to write his own version of the Coral Island, but a more realistic take on it, at least in his mind, a more realistic take on what would happen if a group of boys actually did get trapped on an island. So basically, Lord of the Flies is sort of a dark parody or a satire of the Coral Island. The book also has elements of Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. Now, the plot of Lord of the Flies is it's set in an unspecified time in the future. World War III has just broken out, and England is attacked. So during an evacuation of England, a plane is shot down somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, and it crashes on or near a deserted island, and the only survivors of this plane crash are a group of schoolboys, the oldest of which being 12 or 13 years old. Now, because they're so young, they don't really grasp the severity of their situation, so at first a lot of these boys are kind of into it because they don't have any adult supervision and there's nobody to tell them what to do, but they still try to establish some form of order, and a boy named Ralph ends up getting elected chief, much to the ire of another boy named Jack Meridew. But Ralph ends up picking Jack to be the head hunter because the island has a large population of wild pigs, and they figure that hunting is going to be really important. But throughout the novel, Ralph and Jack start to develop a very antagonistic relationship where it's clear that Jack is hysterically jealous of Ralph because he wants to be chief. Now, in the novel, some of the younger boys start to believe that there is a monster in the jungles of the island, something that the older boys completely dismiss, at least at first. But this fear of the beast starts to affect the older boys as well. And Jack starts using the beast as leverage against Ralph, where he says, hey, Ralph's not doing anything about the beast, but if you elect me as chief, me and my hunters will protect you. So more and more boys start following Jack. The issue is Jack and his hunters are descending further and further into savagery, and Ralph and this boy named Piggy, who sort of becomes Ralph's right-hand man and sort of his advisor to some degree, because Piggy is clearly the most rational out of all of them, they're losing more and more support, and law and order is quickly dissolving. And soon things spiral so out of control that kids do end up getting killed. So, even though William Golding intended this to be sort of a parody of childhood adventure novels, the book ended up being a lot more than that. Because it's set in the future, or at least an alternate present, you could maybe argue that Lord of the Flies is a science fiction novel, even though I don't personally count it as science fiction, but it is definitely a dystopian novel about the breakdown of society and about the thin line between civilization and savagery. It's also very much a Cold War satire and an existential horror story, but above all of that, it's also a dark coming-of-age story about the loss of innocence. But Lord of the Flies is an excellent novel, and there's a reason this book is still read and talked about almost 70 years later, and even though it is very much a book of its time, it simultaneously feels very timeless as well. Now, in the novel, you follow three central characters, Ralph, Piggy, and Jack. Now, Ralph is the novel's primary protagonist, and he's the one who I would say does go through the biggest arc in the story, where he starts off the novel as basically kind of a snot-nosed kid, and you see that with how he treats Piggy. Like, he makes fun of Piggy's asthma by calling it asthma, and he's kind of just a dumbass in the beginning, and for all intents and purposes, he almost shouldn't have been elected chief. But Ralph does grow and mature throughout the course of the novel, and he does try to earn the title of chief. And as it goes on, he does gain a greater appreciation and respect for Piggy. Now, Piggy, I would say, is the novel's secondary protagonist, and he's also arguably the most important character in the novel. Now, Piggy is not the character's real name. You never find out what his real name is, but Piggy is an unfortunate nickname he's received because of his weight. But Piggy represents logic and reason, and how reason should always rule out over fear. And then you have Jack Merridew, who's the novel's primary antagonist, and he is such a little shithead. Like, you just want to kick this kid's ass. Like, you could tell that even before they ended up on this island, this kid was already a bully. Or it's possible that maybe he was bullied, and that's why he's so eager to gain power on this island, because now he finally has power. Like, he's just a shithead, but at the same time, the book does remind you that he is still a kid. Like, at one point when he doesn't get elected chief, he actually runs off crying like a little bitch. But Jack represents what happens when we let fear and irrationality rule out over logic and reason, and he represents what happens when you act on your emotions. But you also see how Jack uses fear to get what he wants, and that's an unfortunate allegory you could make between Jack and some real-life world leaders or politicians that unfortunately is still relevant today. Now, an important symbol in the novel is the conch shell. Or conch, which I think is how you're actually supposed to pronounce it, but fuck it, I'm gonna call it conch because this is Merca, where we say words the way we think they're pronounced. Basically, in the beginning of the novel, Ralph and Piggy find this conch shell, and they end up using this conch shell as their symbol of democracy and civilization, where whenever they hold meetings, whoever holds the conch is allowed to speak. So when the conch is ultimately destroyed, that represents how easy it is for civilization to be shattered. Now, Lord of the Flies, I also think, is definitely an anti-war novel, because in the novel, you see how these boys descend into savagery, and a little war does happen on the island, but you almost forget that in the outside world, there is a world war happening. So you could really look at what's going on the island as sort of a metaphor for the larger global conflict, and in turn, you could look at what's going on in the outside world as a metaphor for what's going on the island. So basically, what's going on the island and what's going on in the outside world is the same, and I think what William Golding is trying to say with this novel is that war is not just a savage thing, but it's also a childish thing. Also, it's easy to hate Jack and the other hunters for devolving to this point. At the same time, though, the book does remind us that they are just kids without any adult supervision, but It's also because of the adult world that they're even in this situation to begin with. Like, they're there because the adult world failed them. Now, the title of this novel, The Lord of the Flies, is actually a translation of Beelzebub, which is a god from ancient mythology that was later reinterpreted as a demon by Judeo-Christian belief systems. Now, depending on who you ask, Beelzebub is either a high-ranking demon or fallen angel in Hell's armies, or he's actually Lucifer himself. Of course, that all depends on whether or not you believe in all that, but in this story, Beelzebub, or the Lord of the Flies, is meant to represent Satan, because there's actually a scene in this book where the devil speaks to a character named Simon. Now, whether or not Simon is having a supernatural experience, or if it's all some kind of a hallucination, is kind of left up to the reader's interpretation, but given that one of the major themes of the novel is how reason should always rule out over superstition, it seems that the latter is the most accurate interpretation. But in the story, the Lord of the Flies is less of a religious devil and is more of an embodiment of the darkness within the human soul. And the Lord of the Flies claims to be the beast that the boys are afraid of, but what these boys don't realize is this beast is not in the jungle. It's within them, within their hearts and souls and minds. Basically, the Lord of the Flies represents the id, the savagery that humanity is capable of, and essentially, we are the beast. We are the Lord of the Flies. Now, apparently there was going to be another scene where Simon encounters a character who is heavily implied to be God, but the editor insisted that Golding cut that scene out, which is probably for the best, because I think that would have been a little much. But yeah, Lord of the Flies is a great novel. I can understand if maybe you're forced to read it for a high school class, maybe you wouldn't be that into it then, which is probably why a lot of my friends really didn't like the book at the time we had to read it, but I do recommend Lord of the Flies a lot if you haven't read it. Now I want to cut to my friend Christian Feliciano, who is a regular guest in my videos, giving his thoughts on this novel. When it cuts back to me, I'm going to be talking about the adaptations of this book, as well as this book's influence on pop culture.
Lord of the Flies is the reason why I don't trust people. When you take away law, when you take away authority, people become savages. I mean, not really. There are countless examples of people actually wanting to help each other when they enter into dire situations. And they've also done experiments to see what would happen if you took away law and authority from kids and left them, I think, on an island, I think it was. And they wanted to see what would happen and also take away their food supplies, see how the kids react, if they would act more savage or they would act more kind to each other. And in fact, they actually found out that the kids actually wanted to help each other. They were split into, I believe, 2 tribes, and they ended up joining together to be able to ration food and water and help each other. So, you know, that's it. That proves that it doesn't always happen, but the way that this book presents it is beautiful, because this book, I know it's the idea is that it takes away law and authority from the kids, but when I look at the book and I analyze it, I realize that it doesn't actually take away law and authority. What it does is it adds another element. As opposed to having laws that are governed by people, now you have laws that are governed by superstition, by religion, by adding this creature known as the Lord of the Flies, this mythical being that lives up on top of the hill that these kids fear, that causes them to act savage and monstrous to each other the way they do in this book. It causes a whole bunch of chaos, death, and just complete horrendous actions that these kids probably would have never done if they didn't have that fear of the Lord of the Flies. So I love that this book presents that to us, that it shows the bad side if you think of religion. Now, I have no problem with religion, personally. I have a religion. I know many people who have religions, especially people who have different religions from me. And we all get along fine and just no problem. But I do understand that there is a bad side to it as well. There are twisted interpretations of holy books and twisted preachers who turn people against others and want to do it for their own personal gain. And like I said, this book does a great job of showing what happens when you add this other element to a society that is lost. it pretty much takes over the kids and it turns them into savages. The kids themselves are very sympathetic because they are stuck in a situation, so they have to survive. And you love them at first, and you see how it's all going so well, but then all of a sudden you realize that the kids are starting to act more tribal. They're starting to act more savage with each other. And then there's even points where there's deaths and a horrible scene with a hog. I won't go too much into it, but there's a hog that they catch, and it's just a really gruesome, brutal scene. And always my problem with the movies that they've done on this book, they don't show that scene all the way through. They kind of cut some of it, and I think that kind of takes away from the point the book is trying to make of how savage these kids have become. That they basically don't even have their humanity anymore. But the book doesn't shy away from much. The book does a great job of just being really gruesome, and I know it is for kids, but it does show you how bad these kids get. It's written very, very well. It moves really quickly. It's a really short book. You can read this probably in a day. It is one of the best books ever. It has great political, social, and religious undertones in it. I think that it's not blatant where it's going to beat you over the head with it, but if you want to look for it, you'll find it. And you don't even need to really research anything. You kind of just know from your own common sense, from your own mind, you can tell what it's saying and where it's going. So and I don't mean where it's going story-wise. I don't mean you can predict the story like it's predictable. No. I just mean what it's trying to say and what it's probably going to say. And that's actually a good thing. You get to understand what the author's saying, but you get to enjoy the story as well. I think that he balanced that out really well. I love this book to death. Pacing, like I said, it moves along really, really well. Dialogue, everything is great. This is a beautiful, beautiful story, even though it is horrendous in the sense that it's violent and it is dark. It's a really dark story, but it is a beautiful novel. It's fantastic, and I love it to death. I recommend everybody read it. Check it out. And yeah, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Now, this was adapted into an independent film of the same name in 1963. Now, I remember I first saw the movie after reading the book for the first time when I was 15, and I fucking hated it. I thought it was cheesy, I thought it was poorly made, poorly acted, but I was also 15 at the time, and over the years I've gained a greater appreciation for independent film, so I rewatched it again recently. And I have to say, watching it again, I liked it a little bit better than when I first saw it. I still don't think it's a great movie. I do think the film is slightly overrated because I know it's considered to be a classic in a lot of film circles, but yeah, I didn't really care for it that much. I will say this, it's very, very faithful to the book. It's almost a scene-for-scene and word-for-word adaptation of the book. But because it's not as well made or as well acted as I think it should be, certain scenes that were so impactful in the book honestly come off kinda laughable in the movie, at least in my opinion. There are also certain things that make perfect sense if you've read the book, but if you haven't read the book, I could see being kinda confusing. I will say this, I thought Ralph, Jack, and Piggy were perfectly cast, and I thought some of the music in the movie was really good, but overall, yeah, I'm not really a big fan of the 1963 film. There was another adaptation of Lord of the Flies in the 1970s, this one being a Filipino film. I've never seen this version of the story. All I know is in this one, apparently it's both boys and girls. There was another adaptation in 1990. This one I did see. I actually saw it right after seeing the 1963 film, and this one I do remember liking, but keep in mind I haven't seen it since I was 15 years old, and I'm almost 30 now, so we're going back literally almost 15 years now. All I remember about this version of the story is the boys are from a military school this time, and there actually is an adult with them, but he's in a coma throughout most of the movie, and Piggy looks like freaking Ripley from Alien 3. I remember one of my classmates actually saying that. There was also an all-female adaptation of this story in 2018 called Lady World. This one was about a group of women who get trapped in their apartment after a major earthquake, and they start descending into savagery when they start running low on food and water. There have also been many different play adaptations of Lord of the Flies. I could also see this book having an influence on the Twilight Zone episode The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, especially the whole idea of these people tearing themselves apart out of fear. You also see that theme in something like George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. Granted, there are actual monsters in that movie, in the zombies, but an underlying theme of that film, and it's a theme that runs all throughout George Romero's films, is this idea that it's actually the human characters who end up fucking themselves over by not being able to put their prejudices aside and work together. Lord of the Flies also had a huge influence on Stephen King, and you could see the Lord of the Flies influence in his books like The Mist, Under the Dome, and even The Long Walk to a certain degree. In Stephen King's book Hearts in Atlantis, specifically in the Low Men in Yellow Coats section of that book, Lord of the Flies was a favorite novel of the two main characters of that story. Also, there's a fictional town in a lot of Stephen King's books called Castle Rock, and the name Castle Rock actually comes from Lord of the Flies. It's the name of this huge rock formation that some of the boys use as like a giant fort. Lord of the Flies has also been parodied on The Simpsons and even SpongeBob. But yeah, that was my review on Lord of the Flies by William Golden, and bye.